Excellent, thank you. Welcome back to the Pension Task Force. This afternoon, first off, we have a conversation with Dan Doonan, who's the Executive Director of the National Institute on Retirement Security. And we all have a copy of your presentation here and welcome you to share your thoughts with the task force.
Okay, thank you. Should I share my screen and put the slides on screen?
Gail, are you able to give him screen share?
I'm not sure if you can hear me from the back end here, so I'll go here on my. Dan, since everybody has printed copies and I can't really use the machine I'm on to do everything that it needs to do for you to share.
Okay,
can you
great.
put it through the hard copies?
Yes, that works. So first, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. My name is Dan Doonan. I'm the director of the National Institute on Retirement Security, or NIRS. Today, I'll share some information that I hope is new to the group. Towards the middle, I'll talk about a few examples and ideas, some things that went on in other states and different concepts that I hope can be helpful to the task force in terms of thinking about the challenge at hand. And in the end, I hope to have a productive discussion and answer any questions you might have. I will say I do appreciate the difficulty of your job and that tough choices lie ahead here. We've seen most, if not all states, go through some form of pension discussions and changes and reforms since the huge impact the Great Recession had on our economy and retirement more generally. A little bit about NIRS to get started. NIRS was created in 2008. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. And our goal is really to be a think tank on retirement, think more broadly about retirement issues. We study retirement in a number of ways. We've looked at how people are faring and preparing for retirement. We recently did a paper looking at hybrid plan designs. We've looked at creative funding strategies that are being employed. We've studied the economic impact, America's views towards retirement, and we talk about ways to get more people on track for retirement more generally. So I'm going to start off and talk a little bit about the pension, the economic impact of pensions in Vermont. In total, there's almost $600 billion of defined benefit pensions paid out in the US in 2018 to 23.8 million retirees. Those benefits supported 6.9 million jobs and 1.3 trillion of economic output nationwide. Pensions, benefit payments coming from pensions are still a very relevant part of our economy. In Vermont, in 2018, we saw 524.4 million in benefit payments, and that supported 4,280 jobs, paying over $208 million in wages. And this includes a direct impact of $313 million. This is essentially pension benefits being spent in the economy. It's sort of the first order impact of pension benefits, as well as an indirect impact of 188 million. And you can think of this as like the second order. If you go to a restaurant, you buy a meal, that's income to the restaurant that goes to the restaurant suppliers. And then there's an induced impact of over $150 million. And that's sort of the third order with enough, if you buy one meal at a restaurant, it's not going to impact employment, but if there's enough people doing that, it has an impact on employment throughout the state. The pension multiplier is 1.28 in Vermont, and this is essentially for every dollar of pension benefits, it supports $1.28 in economic output. And the taxpayer investment factor is $5.41, and this is essentially backing out the fact that a lot of the pension dollars are not coming from taxpayers. So on the next slide, you can see the pie chart And this is essentially where the plan revenues came from between 1993 and 2018. You can see investment earnings are overwhelmingly the largest source of revenue to the plan, but employers also put in over 23% and employees put in about 15% of those revenues over that time. So this is sort of where the money is coming from, and that account, the share coming from employer or taxes accounts for the difference in the two factors I discussed in the prior slide. And then when you look at the economic impacts by industry in Vermont, we're able to get that as well. And really in Vermont, it looks like a lot of healthcare, a lot of restaurants, retail, food and beverage, these kind of industries. Real estate does show up there, but there's also nursing, community care facilities, and different sorts of services like that. So that's the primary industries that have the biggest impacts economically from the pension dollars in your state. Now, I did want to move on and sort of crossing into the second section here, key considerations on pension policy. You know, these conversations involve a lot of different areas. Clearly, you know, the state has an interest in attracting and retaining a strong workforce so that your citizens have quality services. Obviously, retirement security, the benefits are, you know, a lifeline to retirees that work in public service throughout their career. And of course, the cost and impact on the state economy. Now, as I mentioned, since 2009, almost all states have made some sort of changes. A lot of those have been new tiers. And, you know, despite the fact that new tiers have a limited cost impact in the short run, they do impact costs more in the long run. But also, when you think about a workforce, it's usually your younger workers, your newer workers who are more likely to leave, whereas those who've been around for a while are more likely to stay here. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Moving over to the slide with the bar chart for the teacher pipeline. This is the change in the number of students enrolled to become teachers since the Great Recession from 2009 through 2017-18. And then, as you can see, almost every state has seen a decline in the enrollment of college students who are on a path to become, you know, in an education major, essentially, a teacher prep major. Overall in the US, these numbers are down 37%. Vermont is right around there at 38. And then you do see a couple outliers where enrollments went up. I will note that some of that is due to changes in teacher certification. I think in Texas and Arizona, they made it so you can, or in Texas, I think you can go online and sign up to become a teacher through a program that increased enrollments. I think in Arizona, it was Grand Canyon University enrolled a lot of people. So there's some other things, secondary effects going on there as well, where certification standards are being changed. But certainly coming out of the Great Recession, there's a lot of talk about public sector issues, pensions, in education, I think ed reform and, you know, standardized testing. So there's a lot going on there, but we do see fewer students going ahead. And on the slide after that, this is actually a UCLA survey that the Chronicle of Higher Education publishes. And they ask incoming freshmen about a whole host of issues, from their political views to other social issues in their lives. And one of the questions they ask is intended major. What subject do you intend to major in? And what we have here is essentially pulled out the education majors, you know, going back a number of decades. And again, what you see is in the Great Recession, there's clearly a loss of interest in teaching. What used to be about 9.5% on average of all years, 9.5% of people going into college as freshmen were interested in working in education. That's been down to 4.2%, and it pretty steady decline over those years. Apologies that I don't have similar data for other groups of workers that are covered in the Vermont pension systems. But, the Department of Education and teaching is a big enough field that there's actually more data sources there, and it's a little harder to find in other areas. But I did want to share that.
We have a question from Peter Fagan.
Mr. Doohan, thank you for joining us today. Peter Fagan. Just a question regarding the UCLA questionnaire. Was that just for students going to UCLA, or did they query students going to other colleges as well?
No, I'm sorry. That is a nationwide study. They do a survey of incoming freshmen, and it's really not designed for this purpose. Although this is one of the questions they ask. And they've been publishing this survey for many years, but it is all students nationwide.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. So moving on to slide 8, I just pulled the withdrawal decrements from the valuation report. This is for the teacher system, and we'll get to the state employees next. I mentioned towards the front end that it is very typical. Younger and newer hires have a higher rate of leaving and not staying in the job. This sort of puts some numbers to that. You can see 25-year-old males, expected 7.8% to leave that year, and 8.3% of females. So you have about 8% of 25-year-olds may leave. When you get to 30, that drops. It's a little over 5, and it continues falling. So really, I think what you see here is there's some washout in the early years, but once you cross a certain point, there's a very, very increased probability that that person who's stuck around for a while will be a career employee. And I think that's important when you think about some of the changes we're making and some of the messages we're sending to new hires, frankly, with some of the new tiers around the country. If you're coming into a job like this, you're already more likely to leave. If the message is that a benefit's slightly different, that's different than really being far, far below where your peers in another classroom might, their benefit might be. And the slide following that, similar trend amongst state employees. We see, I'm going to focus on group F in the box in the corner. The 25-year-old there, there's actually more of a dynamic assumption here. You have to multiply the columns. So, 6.4% times 1.75, you get about 11.2% chance that a 25-year-old in their third year would quit employment in the state employment plan. And as you can see, the factors on the right go away after 10 years, as well as the decrements on the left continue declining. So what you see is a much higher washout rate early on, and that declines as people sort of commit to their career over time. And this is one of the draws of pensions. Slide 10, we looked at career employment amongst teachers in 6 states. And what we found overall is among the 6 states, the median employee teacher today who's employed will leave with 25 years of service at age 58. So that means 50% will have more service, 50% higher age, and 65% overall would have 20 years plus of service. And there are some conversations around teachers in retirement that talk about the fact that a large number of teachers won't hit full career employment. And really what's going on is there's a fairly quick washout in the early years where people start, they decide this isn't the job for them. But once you get to the actual workforce, you actually see a different picture where there's a lot of commitment to careers. I will note in the different 6 states, Colorado actually includes all education employees, whereas the other 5 are teachers only plans. So Colorado looks to be a little bit of an outlier there. I think there may just be more turnover in some of the other job class categories that are included there. Now I'm going to transition over to some of the concepts that I mentioned I would discuss. And talk about, some of the things we've seen in other states. So I'm going to start with talking about partitioning liabilities. We've seen this in a couple of places. And we'll start in Indiana. And I share this example because I think there's lessons to be learned. It can be instructive, but I do want to be clear that I'm not suggesting you do the exact same thing in Vermont as they did in Indiana. In Indiana, in 1995, teachers were still being hired into a pay-go plan. So, they essentially had a plan that wasn't pre-funded at all. And that was the ongoing plan in 95. So what they did was they closed that plan. They created another with the same exact benefits, which was going to be pre-funded from the get-go. And that left, of course, a lot of legacy costs that had to be dealt with. And they essentially kept that plan on a pay-go basis, where the benefits would be paid from the general fund. Any surpluses in the state budget, would be slid over into that legacy tier to start pre-funding. And plan administrators were very clear consistently that the funding status in the closed teachers plan was intentionally low by design. And the Pension Stabilization Fund was created, to start pre-funding that. And on the next slide, you'll see a bar chart there that lays out essentially the cash flow. So they literally mapped out the cash flow needs for this closed tier. It is a finite group, with the benefits handled essentially with a different funding mechanism. So the ongoing plan was going to use more traditional actuarial funding methods. And these were really pulled to the side, and the state said, we're going to handle these in a different way. We'll have general fund appropriations. We'll have certain instances like surpluses where you'll sweep the money over and handle this. So it's really enabling a separate funding strategy for a part of the plan liabilities. And over time, what you saw is the balance of liabilities between the old and the new tier has shifted. A greater portion of active workers are now in the pre-funded plan, and only about 15% of teachers remain in the pay-go plan. So they're sort of growing out of this, or transitioning out of, being essentially really late to move to pre-funding. And when the plan was closed, the liabilities did continue to grow because you still had actives in there. But those liabilities seem to have peaked in 2015 at 17 billion, and now we're down to 14.3. So they're meeting the obligations, they're paying the benefits, and the 14.3 billion in remaining liabilities is now about 25% funded. So this was really used as a transition strategy. And I think with a plan and being very clear about how they were going to manage this over time and sticking to that plan, I think it's really helped them with external groups like ratings agencies build some credibility. Now, I did want to mention Kentucky did a different version of a liability partition, and I'll be a little quicker with this one because I think it's a little less appropriate for the challenges you're looking at. But essentially, in 2020, the plan was 14% funded, large unfunded liabilities relative to payroll, and the contribution rate continued going up. Employers realized that the contribution to the UAL was a percentage of payroll, and they started, operating differently to essentially get out of the plan, with contract workers or whatever. So as employer payroll fell, the problem kept growing. So they actually partitioned off the UAL and assigned it to employers as a flat dollar amount to be paid off. And in this case, it was largely around preventing the gaming of the funding formulas by employers within the system. But in this case, the cities and counties that would participate in the retirement system were paying their own contribution rate. So it was more relevant in that sense. Similarities in both cases, Indiana and Kentucky, some costs were pulled to the side and handled in a separate way. And the ongoing pension contributions really reflected the value of the benefits that were being offered more closely. With an 81% of payroll going to Kentucky's pension benefits, you know, the benefit itself is worth very little. So it starts to cloud how we see things. And big difference, Indiana kept the legacy plan on pay-go, whereas Kentucky continued to try to get full funding in 30 years. So much more aggressive. And I see those as really bookends. You know, that one or the other isn't necessarily right or wrong, I guess, but you know, the way these were designed, they very different level of commitment and how costs will be timed, how costs will be allocated over time, I guess. Real quickly, I did want to mention dedicated revenues and stabilization funds. There are a number of states that have used dedicated revenues. In Kentucky, they've been talking about it off and on. Oregon does some with sports betting. Some of the revenues go to PERS system there. Illinois and Chicago Casino is funding police and fire pensions. In Kansas, also looking at a portion of casino revenues. And Oklahoma and New Jersey both handled the state lottery proceeds in a different way. Oklahoma has a share of proceeds going to help fund pensions, whereas New Jersey really just transferred the entire state lottery to the pension as an asset of the system. So not only do they get the revenues that are generated, but they literally the ownership of the state lottery, which has an asset value, unlike, you know, a stream of payments that may come in the future. There is a coal severance tax in Montana, and all these, there's a short discussion of all this in our Beyond the Arc report that looks at creative funding strategies that was done late last year. There was another situation in West Virginia. They closed the teachers plan there in 91 and reopened in 2005, the DB plan there. When they reopened, the plan was only 25% funded. So as a way to jumpstart things, they had tobacco settlement revenues coming into the state, coming out of those, you know, lawsuits way back. They actually securitized that for a lump sum, was able to bump the funding up to 50%. They've been funding it responsibly since and have continued to make progress and are in a much better place now. And then the last thing I want to mention, there are stabilization funds in Louisiana, North Carolina, and Oklahoma. So I really see this, MERS doesn't do a lot in this area, but we did want, if you're interested in these things, to sort of give you a sense of where to go start with research. Now on slide 16, I'm going to get to talk a little bit more about incentivizing longer work, not retiring early, and, you know, having people stick around in the workforce. So in your plans right now, in Group F in the state employees plan and Group A in the teachers plan, you have about a quarter of the state employees plan over age 55, and 1,100 out of 8,000 members are over age 60. So there's a lot of people working today who are eligible to retire. And on the teacher side, you have about 22% over age 55 and about 1 in 10 over age 60. Again, here you have a lot of people who are already eligible to retire. So when you think about incentivizing, you know, longer careers and not having maybe different behavior than what you expect, your valuation now expects a certain percentage of people to retire as soon as they're able, and it expects some percentage to continue working. And that's based on past patterns, you know, how are people behaving. If you can find a way to incentivize people to work longer, I think there's a number of cost implications here that are really important to understand. First, on the pension side, that's another year the worker's paying in and not getting benefits. That is somewhat offset by the fact that the benefit will be larger once it's paid, but generally the earlier retirements are going to cost you more. It is plan specific, depending on, you know, a number of factors and how that gets cost out. But generally you see earlier retirements cost more to the system and raise costs. There's also retiree healthcare impact. If you have someone not eligible for Medicare getting retiree health, it is more expensive pre-Medicare, because after you're eligible for Medicare, the healthcare provided by employers becomes more of a wraparound. And I think another aspect to think of it here is, my understanding is if you're a teacher and you're working for a school district, that school district's paying for your healthcare. But when you retire, the state is paying for your healthcare. And if you retire a number of years before Medicare eligibility, there's a big expense there. So I think if you can find a way to incentivize longer employment, even amongst those who are eligible to retire today, I think there's an opportunity there for savings on pension, savings on retiree health, as well as, frankly, having an impact on the workforce management. When we talk about less people being interested in some of these public careers. Now, other considerations, it's optional for the worker. I think, we've seen some reform, either proposals or reform plans that have went through changing pension benefits, and it's caused near retirees to retire in greater numbers than they otherwise would have. So you can lose your savings if you chase, a portion of that 10% that might be retiree eligible. If you chase a lot of those into retirement because they're scared, next year their retirement will look different. That could raise costs and nullify any savings that you manage to find with this committee. So I think, if you can find a way to be non-threatening to the near retirees, so you don't change behavior there, I think that is a plus. And there's a couple, like I said, a couple examples that I'm familiar with, but I think more broadly, it's just kind of common sense that if there's changes coming next year, people might consider retiring before. Now, when you think about an incentive to try to get more, yes.
Mr. Dunn, can I just ask a question about when you say near retirees, what are you talking about? 1 year, 2 year, 5, 10? Is there any?
Yeah, so I think for near retiree, maybe within 5 years of retirement, if you want to think about incentivizing, working past their earliest unreduced age. But what I'm talking about with people who might leave right away are really, you have a lot of people already who are eligible, but they're deciding to work longer. They like their job, they like, what they're doing. Maybe their kids are still in college. So there's a lot of people that could turn around and retire next month, I think. And that's, the people that I think you don't want them to read into things from what's being said and rush for the exits. It would have a cost impact on the state. Is that good?
Yep, thank you.
So if you do think about incentivizing working longer, I think key questions are, what percent work past unreduced retirement now, and how much that might change with the incentive. Obviously, the only savings you get is where the behavior is changing. So I think on the cost side, when you think of that, I think that's a really important thing to consider. Another idea I wanted to mention, and this comes out of Colorado's PARA. Defined benefit plans have been criticized for not being great for people that never vest. Well, defined benefit, defined contribution, you basically get your money back with interest. Colorado PARA actually allows non-vested workers to leave their money in the system. They receive interest and a match, and then the match is increased if the money stays till age 65. And they actually offer annuitization of the non-vested benefits as well. So someone leaving at 4 years that didn't vest at 5 could have a fairly significant amount of their contributions invested until retirement and annuitized. And it essentially is a way of sharing PARA's efficiency and longevity pooling in a way that benefits non-vested hires, but also it can be designed to be done at less than what it costs the system. When you think about annuitization within your plan, you're assuming 7%. If you go out to buy this on private markets where insurance companies have to invest in bonds, you might be looking at 3%. So there's an enormous gap between what a pension can do and what you can buy in the market. It also prevents cash outs. I'll get back to the cost aspect in a second, but we see about 40% of people who get money back from a retirement plan when they switch jobs. They cash it out. The money doesn't stay towards retirement. That's a common thing, and I think especially with smaller amounts. So what Payer is doing is actually helping the employee keep that money in an account that's destined for retirement. It doesn't send them a check where they have to make a decision or find someone to set up an account. I think that's great for retirement security. But again, the efficiency of a retirement system with pooling it can allow you to offer generous terms that are better than what an individual might be able to get themselves. So you could design this, either someone gets actual returns or they get a certain amount of interest credited. And then at retirement, maybe you annuitize at 6 instead of 7, which is your assumption. Or maybe you say the plan assumption minus 100 basis points, and it will actually score as savings if someone goes into it and the benefit provided is slightly less than the assumed returns and longevity and all that. So I think key decisions on that, does it make sense for it to be a default option if you were to think of that? What is the interest crediting? Is it fixed or is it just linked to assumptions or returns? A match. A match is usually used to incentivize certain behavior. Do you want that money to stay in? Is there, a cost benefit to that, to the system? Do you want that money annuitized? And then of course, annuitization, the same thing. There have to be some assumptions there about how you do that. But I think there's a possibility for a win-win there. We already talked about the number of people that will be leaving in the first couple of years of work. And these are really the people that we're talking about with non-vested benefits. So with that, I think I saved a little time for questions and discussion. If there's anything of interest there, that I'd be happy to take questions.
Just kind of curious how the economic impact of Vermont's pension system plays with other states generally.
So what we do there is we take benefit payments by state from census, and we use IMPLAN, which is an economic modeling tool that we buy. And I would say the economic impact in Vermont is less than, like the multiplier is less than nationally. And it's somewhat reflective of what industries are in your state. So if you have a lot of automobile manufacturing in your state, that would show up as a top 10 or potentially show up as a top 10. So it really depends on industries in states compared to how retirees spend money. And that's why you see a lot of the healthcare and retail food and stuff like that. Yes.
Molly, I had a question on page 2. I just didn't catch what you described the taxpayer investment factor. Can you repeat that part?
Okay, so that's essentially the pension multiplier, but adjusted for the fact that only some of the revenues are coming from taxes, right? So you have on the next page the pie chart, where a lot of the revenues coming into the system are investment returns and employee contributions. So that sort of adjusts what is coming from taxpayers as far as, supporting the benefits.
Thank you.
Mr. Dunan, this is Eric Davis. Thank you for being here with the task force today. Very informative presentation. I had 2 questions. You mentioned really thinking about not kind of driving people who can retire, who are eligible to retire, into retirement. I mean, I think we want to avoid that because those folks are actuarial gains to the system. And the longer they're sharing their institutional knowledge with the rest of the workforce, the better as well. Do you have any thoughts on how changes to current employees might affect turnover. I'm trying to think through how changes might affect assumptions in the pension plan. And I'm just wondering your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I think if we're talking about a group of 10 people, 2 of them are going to retire as soon as eligible, 4 of them aren't, and the other 4 are the ones that we might be able to nudge them to consider working longer, right? Those are the 4, if that nudge works, where you see savings. And I think on the flip side of that, and tell me if I don't answer you fully, but I think on the flip side of that, if there's a perceived threat, you could see 6 retire instead of the 2, right? If there's a perception that anyone who retires after next June is going to lose their COLA or lose something, you could see a lot of people run for the exits and nullify any savings that you're going to get. And I think there's been cases where we've seen that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be financially worse to stay for people to have that impression. So I think that's important to think about, is essentially not dig any further with the folks who are already eligible to retire, because once they go out, very unlikely that they're coming back in. So did I fully answer your question there?
That's helpful for the folks that are eligible to retire. I was sort of wondering your thoughts on the folks that might not be eligible to retire, but go into deferred vested status rather and choose to work somewhere else rather than stay in a different plan. Whether you had any thoughts on how changes might affect those groups.
So if we're talking about near retirement, but leaving, well, they could leave, I think, with reduced benefit, but going to deferred vested, I mean, it essentially cuts off the accruals there. So, I mean, that is the group where I think they understand it's worth sticking around to hit retirement age as well. So I don't know how much of an impact it would have there, frankly. So sorry.
No, thank you. It's a tough question to answer. I just I appreciate your thoughts. My second question is as it relates to kind of pension accounting standards and how we think about the unfunded liability. I mean, we tend to think about, because you can put the number on an actuarial valuation, that's a defined number. When there's quite a bit of uncertainty with it. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how we should view specific targets in that regard.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to developing a number like the ADEC, the actuarially determined contribution, that's been pretty customary. We look at that and we say, this is the right amount if we do this every year. And we've had some ways to smooth the ADEC over time, or the ARC, what used to be the ARC. And I think that's useful. I don't think overreacting every up and down in the market is helpful to employers or the people making the contributions. And, I think honestly contributing ahead of the ADEC in good years, so you can do a little less in bad years, would be helpful practice to level costs over time. And, I think in a lot of places that would be helpful practice, is sort of tracking overpayments to make sure you're making it on a cumulative basis as opposed to an annual basis, which could be a little more bumpy. But I think, broadly, when you talk about accounting standards and developing these numbers, the biggest question out there, I think, is around assumed rates of return. I think we have a really good handle on mortality and, people's behavior. We just had the stock market run up, I think, about 40% in last year. So there's good news coming for your plan, but it also could mean that markets might be overpriced a little. that's not really my area, but I sort of understand the views and concerns there. We do sort of look back and we say, well, plans have been making 8%. They've been making this in the past. Interest rates are lower now. So it's not entirely my wheelhouse to, tell you what that should be, but those different views exist. And over the past 10 years, we've heard talk about a 3% discount rate or risk-free. I think our plans have done much better than that over those years. And seem to get the equity premium over time. So risk-free investments might yield this much, and then you expect equities to be more volatile but have higher returns over time. And pension plans do seem to get those. They do come through. So
could you talk a little bit about the Colorado experience, about when they instituted that, and was it successful? Did people actually do that? Did people take up on it? I just a little bit of information on that.
yeah, so I'm not exactly sure when it was in place. We've talked about it in a couple of reports. It's been there for a while. And I know some people, it is utilized. I don't have a percentage on that. I think when you look at retirement more generally, defaults are really powerful as far as driving behavior. So if you use a default that says, your money's going to stay with us, it's going to be invested for you, and you're going to get it later, I think you could have solid participation there. And I don't want to say that Colorado has designed theirs to be under cost to the system. I'm not sure that that's true. It may be designed to be at cost. My point was simply that there is a gap between what you're assuming and what would still be a really good deal for an individual to go get on their own, right? To just buy an annuity. So.
Thank you. I think Peter has a question, and then I think Andrew and Molly both. Oh, you're right.
Good. Thank you, Dan. Dan, so back to the UCLA longitudinal study. The question I have looking at, was there any indication as to where these students are going, what they have chosen instead of education? Why the rather precipitous drop in numbers in education?
They ask about some broad categories. I don't know that you can follow who would have been in education and decided to go elsewhere. So, there are some categories that grow and some categories that shrink. You can look at all the different majors, and I'd be happy to follow up and send you a link to this. So you can take a look for yourself. It's a little hard to say, where it would have been, where someone would have been or where they are now. But I do think, broadly, there's a lot going on as far as public sector employment coming out of the Great Recession. Massive budget deficits, a lot of things happening there. A lot of articles about education, and I think to get education reform, you had to make the case things weren't going so great. So, you saw a lot of stories that went along those lines that, probably aren't attractive to someone thinking about going into that field. The negativity surrounding schools education, I think, probably has an impact, but it's really hard to quantify how much of different things, different.
Dan, Andrew Emmerich, you pointed out West Virginia as a state that didn't really cut benefits, and they were able to really focus on committing to funding and improve their funding liability. I'm curious, are there states that made changes that actually backfired that they thought would help their situation out, and it totally was the wrong approach?
Yeah, I think that probably depends on someone's point of view. I will say San Jose had a pretty aggressive campaign, I think around 2011, and they saw a lot of police and fire leave. They saw a lot of employment. I think the average age in the general employees plan, they were able to retire at 55, but historically people would work to about 60 on average. That dropped a couple years following that campaign, which was a ballot measure campaign. So there was an effort to sort of get people on board with why we should cut benefits. And I think city workers responded in a way that the valuation report for the next couple of years literally tracked a separate gain loss for earlier than expected retirements. And the numbers were significant for people leaving early. So, I think these are hard conversations. I think, you've seen other states. I know in Maine, when they were talking about pensions, there was an effort to bring in the community and communicate with them that I think was accepted, more broadly than I think workers felt, attacked in San Jose's case. So.
Thanks. I just had a curiosity question. On 15, when you were talking about the tobacco settlement in West Virginia, you said that the West Virginia teacher system closed in 91 and reopened in 2005. What happened in the middle there?
Between 91 and 2005,
Yeah.
they had a defined contribution plan. In the early 2000s, they started to realize that teachers weren't on track for retirement, and they went back and started thinking about what to do. They ended up reopening the plan, and I would say took much more seriously how should we get this funded and correct the funding, because even after being closed for a while, the funding ratio was still pretty low at 25. So there was a big deposit coming out of the securitizing the tobacco revenues, and that went from 25 to about 50. And then there was, a commitment to fund over time, and they've continued to go up and improve.
So in the middle, they had gone from a defined benefit to a defined contribution, and then they said, that's not working. They
Yes,
went back.
yeah.
That's it. Thanks.
So I have a question. Do you know of any organization who's doing any research on the really current trends around folks who are eligible for but not yet retired? I'm just curious whether anybody's measuring the impact of a global pandemic on these people whose demographic may put them or their housemate or partner in a highly vulnerable category.
Yeah, that's really tough. We actually had some people want to talk about this last year on a webinar. Are teachers going to be afraid? Are they going to retire? Are they going to, we felt like behavior might change, but it wasn't clear how. At that time, most people hadn't seen much change from expectations. I think since then, it's really been depending on where you are. I think the outcomes have been different in different places. So we've seen some media reports that there's a lot of retirements over here, but not necessarily in other locations. So it is a tricky time to sort of measure against the baseline, given the dynamics from school was done remotely possibly, and you have these restrictions for safety, and I don't know anybody that has. I think every year, these systems do valuation reports, and they sort of track what happened versus what was expected. And I think that's one of the areas that, they'll have to each year true up what happened versus what we thought. So.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for being with us today. I'm Kate, I'm a teacher, and I was wondering if you could speak to any examples that would incentivize deferring your benefit until you're 65. If you were to retire at 58, say, like what sort of incentives are out there to keep people from receiving their benefits until they're Medicare eligible?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you think of financial incentives, it could be done through the pension, but realizing that that is an ongoing cost for life, whereas one-time money is not. So, it looks and it appears larger to an individual, like more attractive. So I think that's one consideration. But I also kind of think of this in terms of prizes. When you see different contests and prizes, they're designed to get you to behave, get you to act, to do something. It doesn't necessarily have to be financial. I don't know that I have any great ideas on that front. But really what you're trying to do is do something that's interesting enough that people will say, I'll stick around. I think if people felt good about making that decision, like they were contributing something to their community, I think, that would all be helpful. And a lot of people like to feel that way. So I don't have a lot of examples to give you, but that's sort of the context of how I would think about it. So.
Andrew Emmerich again. One of the things we were talking about is, so in Vermont, some school districts will pay teachers to retire early. Basically, they're incentivizing them to retire, which obviously has a negative impact then on the pension system. If they would stay longer, that'd be great. Are there states that are giving yearly lump sum incentives to employees to stay, instead of not increasing their pension benefit, but just saying, hey, we're actually going to give you an extra $15,000 to continue working this year? Is that happening?
So I haven't seen it, but it's essentially the kind of thing that I'm thinking. If you did X, Y, and Z, would that save money? And the example you give where there's incentives to retire, that's obviously impacting the pension system. It also shifts retiree or the healthcare costs, right, from the local schools to the state system once you retire. So I think, I look at that in terms of both of those. But yeah, I think to me that would be interesting. I think you'd have to work with your actuary as far as what incentive would maybe work, but not cost more than what we're going to save, because ultimately that's part of the goal. But I would look at that more broadly and incorporate what the savings are on the healthcare side as well in doing that math.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions or anything? All right. Thank you very much for joining us today. This was helpful. And thanks for the handouts. We appreciate that. You can take notes on it. So thank you very much. And I hope it's nice in Washington.
It's great. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Okay, I believe that, and you're certainly welcome to stay with us. Oh, there we go. There you go. Paul, would you like to join us? Sure. Hello.
Hi. Let's get used to this microphone here.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So I have a prepared testimony. Unfortunately, my computer's in the shop, so any kind of ability to do handouts or graphics today wasn't possible. But if there's anything I cover that you would like that kind of information on, just let me know. We'll make sure we get you that. So
Thank you.
So hello to you, the co-chairs, and members of the task force. My name is Paul Silo. I'm the president of Public Assets Institute. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit public policy think tank here in Montpelier, though our staff is working from home, of course. For those of you who may not be familiar with public assets, we research and analyze Vermont tax, budget, and economic policy from the perspective of everyday Vermonters. We publish all of our work on our website at publicassets.org. By way of background, I'm a lifelong Vermonter, originally from Castleton. Went to high school in Rutland, graduated from UVM, and have lived in Hardwick for the past 40 years. I have a long history of public service in Hardwick as a select board member, chair of the planning commission, and a special committee that led to the successful merger of the village and town in 1988, as well as a member of a number of nonprofit boards. I've also served in the Vermont House for 10 years, 4 on the Ways and Means Committee, and 4 as House Majority Leader. I also serve on the Vermont Business Roundtable Pension Reform Task Force. My comments today are not on behalf of the task force, but in my capacity at Public Assets Institute. I say this to you to let you know that I've been in many situations dealing with gnarly issues like the one that you're facing here, and appreciate your efforts to reach a fair solution. The easy issues never need a task force. And I just want to thank you for your public service. I know what that means, and we appreciate it. I'm here to talk with you today about state revenue strategies that might be useful to you as you think about addressing the fiscal issues related to the state's public employee pension systems. As with all state budget issues, public employee pensions have a revenue side and a spending side. In the case of pensions, there are 3 sources of revenue: employee contributions, employer contributions, and investment returns. My comments are related to the revenue sides, specifically state revenue. There is and has been for decades a tendency to avoid discussion of revenues, or to quickly write off discussion of revenue as not possible because the state cannot afford it. I'd like to suggest that that is not the case. There's no magic in Vermont's current level of taxation. It's about 11 to 12% of total personal income. In 2020, personal income, a measure of Vermont's collective resources, Vermonters' collective resources, was $36.6 billion. We raise a little over $4 billion in state and local taxes to fund public services in Vermont. Schools, town and state roads, the courts, libraries, including all public employee compensation. However, not all of that $4 billion comes from the personal income of Vermonters. Some of it paid by non-residents: property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, fuel taxes, rooms and meals taxes are all collected from non-residents as well as residents. So the amount collected from Vermont residents is closer to 10%. 10% of personal income. That is Vermont's tax effort toward all of the state and local public services. So the claims we frequently hear that Vermont has no more tax capacity or that Vermonters are taxed out simply don't stand up. The Vermont Constitution is a lot about the common good. That's the reason we came together to form a state in the 18th century. Chapter 1, Article 9 states in part, and I'm quoting, "Previous to any law being made to raise a tax, the purpose for which it is to be raised ought to appear evident to the legislature, to be of more service to community than the money would be if not collected." Some suggest that it's irresponsible to raise revenue, that we should make do without additional revenue. I suggest that it's irresponsible to not raise revenue when the common good of the people requires it. This is the balance that the Constitution has empowered the legislature to strike. Now, why is there a perception that Vermont cannot afford to raise revenue? A major reason is that we have had a growing divide between those at the top and everyone else. And we tax lower income people more heavily than many people with higher incomes. That's the definition of a regressive tax. When the COVID recession hit, many Vermonters had still not recovered from the Great Recession. While real income for those at the top was up 8%, those at the bottom saw a 7% drop from 2007 to 2019. There was no improvement in poverty or real median household income by the end of the recovery during that period. Half of all Vermont income in 2019 was in the hands of the top 20%. It is true that most Vermonters pay enough in taxes, but that's not true for all Vermonters. Many Vermonters at the top with much greater amounts of discretionary income still pay less as a percentage of their income in state and local taxes than their lower income neighbors, according to a 50-state analysis by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, which you may have seen. Additionally, in 2017, the federal tax cuts left $500 million in formerly collected federal taxes in the hands of Vermonters, most of it in the hands of the top 20% of taxpayers. This is money previously paid in taxes that is no longer being collected, $500 million each year. So the suggestion that all Vermonters are overtaxed is not true. A revenue strategy targeted to those at the top could raise additional needed revenue without hurting those who already pay enough. Specifically, a 1% surcharge on the income of the top 1% of Vermont taxpayers would raise about $33 million. 3% would raise $100 million a year. As you heard from Graham Campbell in his testimony a few weeks ago, eliminating Vermont's capital gains exclusion would raise another 15 to 20 million per year. So as you come up with a fair allocation of responsibility to address the public pension challenges, I would encourage you to consider state revenues like those I've just discussed as part of the solution. What's at stake is the integrity of state government services and public schools that need to attract talented young people and retain current talent with an attractive compensation package. In the end, the question is not what's the cheapest way out. The question is, how do we do the best to meet our state residents' need for these critical public services? So those are my prepared remarks, and you get the drift. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or if I can't answer them, get you the answers to those.
Anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, observations?
I would love a copy of your testimony, just because some of what you said flew by me. And
Yeah, I haven't sent, I will send Gail a electronic copy as soon as I get my computer back,
that would be
which
great.
should be today.
Okay,
So
thank you so much.
Andrew Emmerich, is there any evidence that high taxes are driving Vermonters out of the state or driving people away from the state?
that's a commonly asked question. I think the answer is no, not in a way that actually affects the revenue produced by those taxes. So here's what I mean by that. I think any of us probably could say, you know somebody, or you know somebody who knows somebody who left the state and claimed they did it because of the taxes. But the fact is that there is a churn annually of about 15 to 16,000 people that leave Vermont and come into Vermont every year. So if you know 2 or 3 or 5, you don't know very much about what's happened in terms of that conversation. So we look at the statistics from the IRS each year. And actually in the most recent year that we have, which was 2019, we actually saw that the income group with the largest influx to Vermont were people with more than $200,000 in income. And I think the Joint Fiscal Office has also testified to the legislature about that. So that there have been a number of studies, national studies, about taxes that target upper income, the wealthiest people, or the highest income people. And they all show that while there may be some change, it's not anywhere near enough to make the tax change not worth doing. In other words, you lose a little, but you don't lose very much. So that's one point I would make. The other is that we've done, and you may have heard this, in this IRS analysis, we can look at where people leave a state and where they go for all 50 states. So you see all this transaction. And we're often compared to New Hampshire. New Hampshire doesn't have an income tax, for example, and Vermont does.
Right.
But New Hampshire has a higher percentage of people moving to Florida where there isn't an income tax than Vermont is moving to Florida. So that you have these suggestions. You can't get sort of a definitive answer, but there's suggestions that that's really, that phenomenon has not had a big impact on taxes.
Thank you. Senator Corey Parent, could you let me know what it means to be so how much income does one need to be in the top 20% of income earners? Like what's the floor?
It's about 100,000. A filer is about 100,000.
So could that include like a family of four at 100,000?
I think it's the way the IRS or the state reports it is filers. So it's, I don't know the percent, you can't tell from that what
Right.
percentages are.
But like my wife and I file together. So if our joint
Right.
filing's over $100,000, so potentially we could say that half of all income growth in the state of Vermont has gone to people who make theoretically as little as $50,000 a year and more. If they're
Well,
going filing.
it's $100,000 in filers. So
Right, but if two $50,000 income earners create a $100,000 filer, if they're married.
So the other way of looking at it is that 80% of Vermonters make less than that.
Yeah, and does that include like self-employed Vermonters who through tax, federal tax law can really show zero or little income
It
and still have
includes
assets?
Whatever the AGI is of the filers.
Okay.
And then that's earned income, right?
That's adjusted gross income.
Adjusted gross income.
Yeah.
And we don't, special.
So it
special
includes earned
categories
income.
For unearned income.
Andrew?
So we've been talking about exploring other revenue considerations, including gambling, cannabis. We have talked about the elimination of the capital gains exemption. Are there other potential revenue things that are maybe smaller that don't get thought about as much?
That's a tough question. Yeah, the answer is yes. What I actually brought before you is today, if I were testifying in front of a tax committee, we'd get into more technical details, which I wasn't sure you wanted to be subjected to. I know Graham has been in and have gone through the details, but there are things related to the income tax that we've proposed in the past that could make, that are adjustments that could be something other than a surcharge on the top income that would have a similar impact.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, thank you for the input. I will say that the suggestion for to generate more income by an increase in taxes on the top earners, it has been, since I've been in the legislature for 18 years, it seems to come up every year. It has never, it's hard. It's a hard conversation. And I guess my question is, even if it was accepted, even if this committee made a suggestion and it was accepted by the appropriations and the finance committees, does it then mean that there's less potential earning extra income for all those other things? Because I've seen everybody has put their stamp on any increased income on higher earners. Everybody has put their stamp on
Right.
the cannabis funds. And so if we use this money for pensions ongoing, then do we shortchange others? I guess that's a question that I grapple with all the time, is how higher education wants all of it. There's a bill to do it for higher education. There's a bill to do it for childcare.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think, that is the policy question, essentially, it's a priority issue. And, but I think what I'm suggesting is that not so much that there's this limited amount that you can either put it in pensions or you can put it into higher education or something else. But that as you're thinking about addressing difficult public policy problems like this one, and And I would say others that, that have been around since I was in the legislature, that they're difficult issues, and that many of these issues are issues that you're facing now because we actually didn't raise the revenue to cover them in the past. And so I think there's an opportunity. So it's more an invitation. It's not a suggestion like this is what you should do, is raise this amount of revenue. It's more, as you work this through and are looking to solve problems, you're really weighing, and this is why I brought up the Constitution question, or the Constitution language, you're really weighing the public good versus the money. And often what happens is we compromise the public good because we're unwilling to raise the money, which I think creates a lot of the problems that we deal with. So if there's one message or one takeaway from today, that's it. I think we could talk, if it gets to the point where there's, technical, you're down to, okay, we need to raise X amount of revenue, and technically, how do we do that? That's a different question than really the one I'm bringing, or issue I'm bringing to you today.
So it's my understanding, it was before my time, something called the snelling surcharge. Is that something you could speak to?
Yes. I was on the Ways and Means Committee at the time we did that. That was in 1991. And it was in the face of a recession, that 1990. And without the influx of federal dollars that we're seeing now. So the Snelling administration was faced with the problem of cutting services, raising revenue. This problem that this is the problem that policymakers face. And at the time, Governor Snelling talked about, unwilling to have the state sort of go below a minimum level of decency is, I think, what he said. He was some language like that was a standard in terms of the people, and he recommended that there was a surcharge. We were piggybacked on federal tax at that point. So there were 3 tiers, and so he recommended that we have surcharges on each of the 3 tiers. And I don't remember off the top of my head how much money it raised. It was in place, I believe, for 4 years. I think I'm pretty certain it was repealed in 1995. And his thought was that we would be through the recession. As it turned out, that was about right. So yeah, that was a temporary tax. I think the challenge you have, it may be a temporary tax it certainly could be useful to this problem, but I think the challenge you have is a longer term issue, and that you're kind of looking for revenues that have some staying power if you are going to go the revenue route. Yeah.
And I worry that both the political climate we're in right now and the fiscal environment we're operating in right now are very different than when Republican governor recommended a surcharge.
Yes.
We're sitting on budget surpluses as opposed to looking at the threat of having to make deep budget cuts.
Right. Yep.
I heard a figure and I wanted to make sure I had it right because it's a little shocking to me. I think you said that since 2017, federal tax cuts have benefited Vermonters $500 million a year.
Yeah.
500 million a year.
Yeah.
Are currently in Vermont in the hands of the wealthier Vermonters than were prior to the Trump era.
That's total, 500 million a year total. So that 20, well, in other words, it's not about 350 million is in the category of the top 20%.
Okay.
So 350 million of the 500, but so 500 million a year is the amount of money that Vermonters are not paying in federal tax that they were previous to 2017. 2018 is when it took effect.
350 of that in the top 20%. And
Top 20%, right.
150 in the other 80%.
Right, exactly, right.
So I just have a question about, why do we use the top 20% when, I guess I didn't realize that when we talk about the top 20, we're talking about $100,000. Because if you have a family of 4 people and you're living on 100, I mean, it sounds like a lot of money. It sounds like a lot of money to me, but it isn't a lot of money. If you're making rent payments and healthcare payments and you have a disabled child or what, it's saving for college, you have 2 kids in college, $100,000 is not a lot. So why don't we, if we're talking about the top tiers, why don't we bring it up to?
Yeah, I mean, you see the top 5%, 1%. It just depends on, that's a quintile. And so some of this data we end up getting in quintiles. So that's why we end up with 20%. But I would also say that, if you're making 100,000, regardless whether it's a family of 4 or a couple or individual, and 80% of people are making less than that, that it says something about where the state is, where people are in the state. And it's not an insignificant piece of information to know that the top 20% is that low, and that the other 80% is lower than that. I mean, I think if you sit with that, now granted, some of it may well be that there are, businesses or whatever, but that's not the majority of, when you look at the mass of most of Vermonters falling in that category, what that means. I think it's also useful, but I take your point. I think it's like the top 1% starts at about $425,000.
But it's filer, right? Not so in Corey's.
Yeah, it's filers.
Situation. If I'm making $100,000 and filing by myself, I'm one filer, but he has 2 incomes
Right.
making $100,000. So his costs are going to be considerably more than mine because he has to have a bigger apartment
Right.
or house and has to have childcare so that they can go to work and.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's no, unfortunately, we struggle with this all the time with, the data doesn't come in exactly the form you're looking for. And so you try to work with what's there and say, what can we learn from this? And so it's useful, these questions are useful, but it's also important, I think, to look at, what's also there, what you can see that's there. So, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Eric.
Kind of a timing question. I mean, I think we need to acknowledge it's always a difficult time to raise new revenue, whether it's during the snelling days and an economic downturn. I mean, that's a tough time to ask people to pay more. I get the point that we're not in that situation now, but yet we're sitting at this table talking about changes to benefit the public employees. And it seems like what's unique about the timing here is those federal tax cuts, that there really is an existing capacity out there that was tapped not too long ago. What's your perspective on that, the unique kind of circumstance there?
Well, we've talked about that there's, as soon as the federal tax cuts passed, and there was it created capacity within Vermont, and the legislature in 2018 and 2019 were struggling with issues. We talked about the fact that those funds were now available to Vermont. The federal government wasn't collecting those. And actually, what we expected over time is that would mean that the federal government would be able to send less money to the states. But I think there is that's one of the capacity issues, which is why I brought it up today. But I think I don't know enough about, I haven't followed all of your meetings, and so I don't know enough about how you're thinking about a solution. But as Representative Copeland has pointed out, we're awash in money at this point, the state because of the federal influx of dollars. So a solution, if, when you're on the revenue side, a solution could involve some one-time money or short-term money, and then a revenue source that kicks in 5 years from now or something. Because as I said, you're looking at a long-term issue that you have to figure out how it's going to last whatever period of time, decades into the future. So I don't know the answer to that with the information I have, but I think that it's just another piece of, in the puzzle.
Well, again, can I check more numbers that I wrote down? See if
Yeah.
I might. When you were talking about the 1% surcharge and the 3% surcharge,
Yeah,
was that on the top 1%?
yeah,
Okay, so a 1% surcharge on the top 1% of filers would bring in 33 million?
yeah. So again, I wasn't going into detail here, but there's adjusted gross income and there's taxable income. If you use adjusted gross income, it's about 34 and change per year for on the top 1% of filers based on adjusted gross income. If you use taxable income, it's about 32 and a half. So I kind of split the difference and said 33 and didn't specify which of those you pick, but it's in the ballpark that it's between 96 and 103 if you use 3%. So it's, 100, call it 100 for the sake of the conversation today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for being here. I appreciate your testimony. I appreciate your perspective that Vermont is not taxed out, I think was the words that you used. And I just, while we were talking a bit about the 20% that you had mentioned, I just want to remind the task force that when Grant Campbell was here, we were looking at Vermonters making over 300,000 annually. So there's what I'm hearing you saying that there's money left out there. There's money out there that could help us solve this pension problem.
Well, that's right. And I wasn't, nothing in my testimony suggests that we should be taxing people in the top 20%. I'm actually, the example I used was the top 1%. I mean, you could pick a different number about what you think is, upper income. There is more information about that might be helpful if you want to go down that path in terms of figuring out where to draw that line and that sort of thing. If you get to that point.
Thank you.
So, I mean, you're probably aware that President Biden has suggested raising taxes at the federal level. So, I mean, this gap that exists today in Vermont may no longer exist in the near future.
I'm sorry, John, what did you just say? I couldn't hear you.
Oh, President Biden is contemplating raising taxes. So I just want to make sure Mr. Solo is aware that exists and that this gap from the capital gains cut may no longer exist in the near future.
You mean from the, the capital gains cut, you're saying, or are you saying the 2017 tax cuts?
2017 tax cut.
Yeah, okay. Yes. But as we know, we're in a political environment and you have to assess the likelihood of that's actually going to happen. So I think, is it worth watching? Absolutely, it's worth watching. And but there's no certainty that that's going to happen, especially given following the legislation, the current legislation that Biden is trying to get through Congress. So yes, that's the proposal. Whether or not that becomes real, I don't know.
So it's just a question of political reality in Washington as to whether that.
Yeah, right. So that's one of the considerations is,
What do you think the political reality of a tax on the wealthy in Vermont is? Having served in the House and on Ways and Means, getting a bill through both the House and the Senate and signed by the governor, is that realistic in this coming session?
Well, I think the difference is that we're actually in that conversation. We're not in the conversation in Washington. And so we actually have some say. No, I don't, but you do, in what actually happens. So you get to actually define political reality in Vermont in a way that none of us can because we don't serve in Washington.
Well, I understand that, but I guess my point is just political reality in Vermont.
I don't know that there is a political reality. I think my experience was, every 2 years after an election, members come into the state house, and it's really an empty chamber filled with the people, some returning, some new, who get to decide what's going to happen. And we start with adopting rules and all the things that legislators do in the first few days of the session. And so who comes in after the election determines, what the political reality is. It really is the political reality of people. So I feel like it's a different kind of conversation because one we're in and one we're not in as directly. So I don't have I guess the short answer would be, I don't have an answer about the political reality in Vermont.
Oh,
I think one of the things that we have to realize.
Leona, put the mic closer to you because the people out there in the other world can't
In the
hear.
world. So I think one of the things that Representative Gannon was just mentioning is, well, how will we get, if we propose taxes to the 1%, whatever percent of the 20% that we could possibly add additional tax. You're saying, how will we push that through? But I think we talked about this at an earlier meeting or whatnot, but these are not definites, right? We're just trying to say, we're going to look at all the options. We're going to put everything on the table so that we get to writing this report, just writing the report and getting everything prepared and tasking it out. We're saying, what are the options we've looked at? We're not saying, hey, yeah, this is definitely going to be signed by the governor, but we're saying these are the options that we're going to be putting forth, and we're going to try to make sure these are the best options possible after we've talked about it, thought it through. But it's not like, well, how are we going to get this to the House and through the Senate and have the governor sign it? Good questions, but I don't think that's what, and I think we talked about this earlier, and I remember this conversation before, but it's about saying, hey, we are making sure we're putting everything on the table as we try to look at the solutions to this huge, this huge problem, so we don't have to be here again in 10 years trying to solve it.
I do agree with that, but I think that we need to be a little more definitive in our proposals than just coming up with options, because if we can't come up with something that that all of us can buy into,
Yes.
and we just instead have a list of options, it's going to go to the legislature, and the legislature is just going to tear it apart and do whatever they want to. So we need to be pretty clear about which things that we are recommending as options, both for increasing assets and decreasing liabilities. I think we need to be pretty clear about, we can have some options, but I think.
Oh, no, I'm talking about
yeah.
detailed options, not like, oh yeah, just toss that out there. Nothing like that.
Yeah.
No, detailed.
So I was just looking at this, and I don't know who these people are, but apparently there are 3,000 people in Vermont, 3,000 filers in Vermont that pay, that are in the 1%. And if we're gonna raise $30 million on that 1%, that they're each gonna pay about $10,000 a piece. Is that, I mean,
It's there are about 325,000 Vermont filers. So
Yeah.
1%, it would be 32.5. It depends on the year but yes, 3,000 is in the ballpark.
So those 3,000 people would each be paying an additional $10,000.
Whatever, I don't know.
Well, I divided
Yeah.
that into 30 million.
Okay, yeah,
My little brain
yeah, okay, fine.
isn't too fast here, but
Yeah.
I can divide 3 into 30,000. So, okay, good. Okay, I'm not for it or against it, increase in.
So that's an average. So what you just did is an average tax.
Yeah.
And so it's close, this is close, but that bracket, or if it's really a bracket, but it sort of is, starts at about 425,000, but it also includes people that have incomes of multi-millions.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't know off the top of my head what the average is for that, those 3,200 people. But, so then you'd have to look at what is 10,000 a percent, as a percent, you know, whatever.
Right.
So I'm going to act as the timekeeper here and say thank you very much
Yeah.
for the time with us today. And I appreciate you being willing to send your remarks after you get your computer back from the shop, so that folks can do some digesting of what you've said to us.
Or even just giving them to Gail and she can make.
Yes, if
Yeah,
you
I'll
can
email
give them
them
to
to Gail.
Gail,
Yeah,
she can put them
absolutely.
up on
Yeah.
the.
Well, thank
on
you.
the
Thank you
page.
for having me. And if,
Okay.
as I said, if there are follow-up questions that either when you see my remarks, you have whatever, feel free to get in touch with me. I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So folks, we have eaten into 10 of our 15 minutes of a break. And we also had the 2 additions to the agenda that were requested earlier today. So how are folks feeling about the need to take a 15-minute break? Could we take a 5-minute break and try to get back on track with Chris Roop jogging us through the actuary's report on the impact of one-time and recurring revenue? 5 minutes, is that okay? I doubt it. There's a-
I thought it was 2:30, I think.
Just for people's information though, Michael brought this over, Michael Clausen brought this over, and it is the, what happened with the lemurs rate increases that were passed. So if anybody wants a copy of this, I could have Gail make copies and we can, so that you can see what we did in 2018.
Great.
Get it posted to our page.
Yeah, I'll give it to Gail.